welcome the opportunity to say a few words on this bill, and as usual I want to thank the Library and Research Service, again under pressure in relation to producing a digest for us under pressure. And this bill is 17 sections in 2 parts. And the first thing, I have both positive and negative things to say about this bill, but I never agree with waiving pre-legislative scrutiny. I think it's a bad decision, and I think there are issues here that should have been teased out on pre-legislative scrutiny. There was no regulatory impact statement, and it's been rushed through. And as been said by Deputy Ward, we're now amending a bill that got hours and hours, and I feel for the staff, because that 2024 bill was practically impossible. Late hours, late nights, and that was the bill to amend the 2000 Act to bring clarity and certainty, and it also not just to the legality and what was set out in the bill and the Act, but in relation to the market. And it has utterly failed to do that. We haven't implemented it. There have been 2 orders to implement 2 little parts of it, and here we are today in the second last week of term, rushing through a bill that's going to now amend an Act that was only passed a few months ago after years of discussion. So it's just a most unacceptable way to do business. And it also promotes the narrative, which the government is leading, that objectors are the cause of the problem. And I'm going to say again on the record that any planning system should be robust enough to deal effectively and quickly with concerned residents and citizens' submissions. I don't think there are objections. The people I know go to great trouble to put in a submission at personal cost and financially, and do their best, and it's always a David and Goliath with them, always. And it has been recognised by the courts that there's a trinity involved always: the community, the residents, the developer, and the local authority or the planning. And we really want to stop blaming people who take the trouble to put in submissions. Having said that, as pointed out, the major bill from a few months ago, the substantial amount has not been commenced, and yet there is a need to amend it, amongst other matters, to ensure that the updated housing requirements in the revised National Planning Framework can be quickly incorporated into the planning system, and to provide certainty that this may lawfully occur under the 2000 Act, which is 25 years old, which we were supposed to have amended or repealed. And we're doing all of that because we haven't rolled out the Development Act of 2024. Really, Minister, I don't know, I don't have the words, but I do think it's the subject of Callan's kicks, or somebody with a sense of humour and irony, that we're now in this position amending an Act that hasn't come into being, and there's no explanation really given for that. So we have transitional measures, which I agree with, to facilitate the variation of development plans and local area plans that were commenced under the Act of 25 years ago, so that they may continue, even when the relevant sections of that Act haven't been commenced in the new Act. Now, I repeat this because it's just so Kafkaesque, really, isn't it? And we need to do this to offer continuity, legal certainty and operational flexibility. And that was the purpose of the 24 Act. The judicial review and discounting the planning permission until the judicial review process is complete is a practical suggestion, and I don't have difficulty with that. However, I do have difficulty with the narrative that's going on, and it was actually, I forget the man's name, but I think he's chair of the Infrastructure Committee, and I have mentioned him before in the Dáil, talking about objectors running down to the courts and doing a judicial review. You've given absolutely no evidence anywhere of that, and I'm going to go back to the figures that have been given by the Bill's Digest, which is a tiny amount of the planning permissions that sit there and are not activated. And it's certainly not being caused by judicial review. So if you're going to give that narrative on every interview and everywhere, then there's a duty on you to give evidence and facts to show those judicial reviews and the numbers of them. So we're doing that, which I've no difficulty with. I do have difficulty with the extension of housing permissions that might otherwise lapse, are nearly at the end of their duration period but have not yet commenced. and they're going to get an extension of up to 3 years. They must apply, I welcome that, within a 6-month period of the Act commencing, although we've no idea when this bill, when it becomes law, will be commenced, and then they have to start within 18 months. And we're told that's presumably to ensure that developers don't sit on undeveloped land for an extended period, and obviously increasing the value. So nobody has asked why they haven't acted up to now, Minister. There's nowhere in the paper do I see set out why planning permissions haven't been acted on, except for the few that are subjected to judicial review. Now, there are thousands, but in the scheme of the overall planning permission numbers, which I'll come back to, they're less than 10%, I gather. And then we hear things like financial obstacles or the rising cost of materials. I really would have liked to have been set out what were the obstacles to start these planning permissions. Nowhere. There's absolutely, I don't see anywhere except the over and over and over judicial reviews. And that's what the purpose of pre-legislative scrutiny is for, to set all that out. I don't see a breakdown of the judicial reviews in relation to county. I'd love to know how many judicial reviews were taken in Galway County and City, how many planning permissions there are sitting because of judicial reviews, are sitting simply because developers are sitting on the land and waiting for things to change. And we've heard an announcement recently that the apartments are going to be reduced in size. I cannot think of anything more obscene, actually. We've learned nothing if we think it's okay to reduce the size of an apartment. I want to pay tribute to Professor, Associate Professor or Assistant Professor Orla Hegarty, who clearly articulated that this government proposal would not lead to a reduction in costs, clearly on Morning Ireland. A public servant at best, clarifying that this proposal would not reduce the cost of apartments, and went on to say how the cost could be reduced and looked at various ways that it could be reduced, one of which is to get builders to build houses and pay them a monthly salary. One of the many good suggestions that she made, rather than being developer-led all of the time. So if I go back now to the digest and just the figures that have been given there in relation to page 16, I'll just look at page 16 for you and see the figures, and maybe you'll come back with different figures. More than 50,000 apartments in Dublin, notice it's not the rest of the country, have planning permissions but have not commenced. So 50,000. Of the 82,700 homes permitted citywide, over 2/3 remain inactive. And then they give us the figure, ministers, if you could have your attention for a little while, because while approximately 7,500 units, 7,000 are affected by judicial review, the majority, nearly 50,000 are stalled for other reasons. And there's absolutely no elaboration, Minister, of what those other reasons. I read all your press releases. I read what you said about judicial review, some of it which is okay and I accept to a point, but no reasons given for the failure to activate all of those other planning permissions. And now you're actually going to make it easier for developers to sit on land. Rather, in my opinion, of resourcing local authorities, we have the Taoiseach coming out condemning local authorities, and I certainly have been critical of local authorities, and particularly in Galway. But they were stopped building housing back in 2009, and when we got our quarterly report, it said construction suspended, and it remained suspended until 2020, and we're going to blame local authorities for that. Your mother, the Cahirley.